In the second reading of Parsha Shemos, Moshe Rabbeinu is born. It's things that happen with him, but not things that he does. And in the third reading, Moshe Rabbeinu starts to do things. And the reading opens up with the words, Vayihi bayomim oheim vayigdal Moshe. And so it came to pass in those days, and Moshe grew up. Now Moshe Rabbeinu was placed, as you might remember, in a little basket in the reeds, and he was rescued by the daughter of the Pharaoh, and he didn't want to eat from anybody else. He refused to nurse from anybody else, so Moshe Rabbeinu ultimately ends up back with his mother, being on the payroll of the Egyptian government. And irony of ironies, Moshe Rabbeinu is now taken to the palace, where he is adopted by the daughter of Pharaoh, who's a very righteous woman. Her name is Basia. And she's the one who names Moshe, the name that sticks, although he is named Tuvia and Yedidya and all kinds of other fancy names. But the name Moshe ultimately sticks. And now we read of little Moshe growing up in the palace. And so the days came to pass. Vayigdal Moshe, Moshe grows up. And the Torah says, Vayetze el Echav, he goes out to his brothers. Vayar besivleisom, and he saw their burdens. Vayar ish Mitzri, and he saw an Egyptian man, Makeh ish Ivri, beating a Hebrew man, Me'echav, from his brothers. This verse requires much elucidation. Not the least bit, because it starts off with the words Vayigdal Moshe. So Vahi Bayom Mehem just talks of a passage of time. But if you take a look back in Pasuk Yud, it is very says Vayigdal Hayelad. So the verb that describes what happened to Moshe is in the beginning of verse 10. And then in verse 11 it says there was a passage of time, Vayigdal Moshe. The same word shows up. So both times he grew up. In other words, he grew up twice. What does it mean he grew up twice? Why did he grow up twice? Why does the Torah use the same exact terminology, Vayigdal, and then a second time, Vayigdal? So Rashi says, he asked this question openly, which is unusual. Usually Rashi expects you to figure out the question yourself. Here he asks you, he says, what's going on here? V'haloi kvar kosav, it already is written, Vayigdal hayelad. The only difference is there it says Vayigdal hayelad, the boy grew up, and here it says Vayigdal Moshe. Moshe grew up, but the yelad is Moshe, and Moshe is the yelad, so why would the Torah repeat the same thing twice? So Rashi says, Amar Rabbi Yehuda b'Rabbi Eloi, Harishin lekoima. The first time it says Vayigdal, it refers to gestalt. It refers to size. He's a big boy. He grew up. He wasn't a baby anymore. Walking on his own 2 feet. He's a mensch, we call it. V'hasheni legdula. But the second was for a position of prominence. Sheminuhu parai al beisai. That at this point, the Pharaoh said, I have a little crown prince growing up in my house. I'm going to give him an important job. So they maybe tailored him a little uniform. And he said, now you are the chief of staff. You're going to be responsible for what goes on in the Pharaoh's house. He's being groomed for, it seems, future leadership. And as the Pharaoh grooms Moshe for leadership, which is the notion of minu parai al beisai, that the Pharaoh appoints him over his home, as that happens, Moshe Rabbeinu does indeed grow up. And how does he grow up? He grows up because Vayetze el Echav. The first thing he does is goes out to his brethren. He becomes aware of the fact that he's a Hebrew and that there's brethren, and he goes out to them. And this is the first sign of a Moshe Rabbeinu, that he transcends his own orbit. He transcends his own comfort zone. Vayetze. He goes out. He goes outside of his little area. He lives a perfectly sheltered life. Everything is wonderful. The Basia dotes on him, and he lives in the lap of luxury, and yet, Vayetze. He goes out. He goes out to the ghetto. He goes out to the concentration camps. He goes out to see the horrors. Vayar besivleisam. And he sees their burdens. And then after he sees their burdens, then he sees something else. But I want to take you for a moment first to Rashi, and then we'll take a look at some of the other Mefarshim. Vayar besivleisam. Rashi says something very interesting. Just as Vayetze is a purposeful decision, he decided to go out. It doesn't say nafal. Nafal would mean he fell out. So if he would be in the royal palace and the window would open, he would fall out, and wow, look what he saw. He didn't expect this. He fell into it. He saw it. This is not an accident. Vayetze, it was a decision he made. He decided to transcend his comfort zone. He decided to go past his own orbit. This is where he's usual. This is where he's typical. This is where Moshe Rabbeinu lives. Now he goes outside of that. That's clearly a decision Moshe made. The Rashi says, you should know that just as the Vayetze is a decision he made, the Vayar is also a decision he made. You see, seeing things are oftentimes happenstance. I happen to see it. I happen to notice X, Y, and Z. I happen to see such and such. How did I see it? I was there. So I saw it. It doesn't indicate that a person took the time to see it or made pains to see it or looked into a situation. I saw it. It came across my path. The truth is, the Holy Baal Shem Tov taught us that when something comes across your path, that's also not happenstance. And that also has a message for you. And that also is supposed to inspire you. And you should look more deeply. But the point that's being made here, Rashi says, is Vayar b'sivleisam nasan einav liboy. He looked into this. This was not just a question of happening to see something. He looked deeply. Nasan einoi. He put his eyes. Eyes means really he put his intelligence into this. He wanted to see past the facade. Nasan liba, he put his heart into this. He related to this emotionally. Sometimes you see things and you're living in an ivory tower of indifference. It doesn't make a difference to you. It doesn't touch you. Here Moshe Rabbeinu, he empathized. He looked into the situation and he identified with the suffering. And so, as Rashi says, he began to suffer with them. He was empathetic. He felt their pain. So he made a point of looking into the situation. And he felt their pain. And then he saw something else. Now it's interesting that Ramban, when he explains the Vayigdal Moshe, he says, well, the first time he's talking about it, that he was weaned. He was sent off to his mother to get nursed. Okay, the Gemara says it's maximum of 24 months, so he got weaned. He was finishing nursing, and now finished breastfeeding. Now he went off to Batya, who couldn't breastfeed him, but she could feed him baby cereal. And he says, that he became intelligent. He became a smart little boy. He knew what was going on around him. So really and truly, Ramban's approach seems the more natural approach. It's strange almost. It's like surprising that Rashi takes a different approach. That Rashi says the second Vayigdal is not talking about the natural growth that would have ensued from him, but rather a growth that was imposed upon him. The Pharaoh appointed him. It's almost not the Vayigdal. He grew up. The Pharaoh grew him up. He made him grow up, which is very unusual. Why Rashi would say that? So I think that it has something to do with the fact that the words are so similar. And since it says Vayigdal both times, there has to be a corollary between the two Vayigdals. In Ramban's interpretation, there is no connection between the two. One is a biological thing, a physical thing. He was breastfeeding, and then he wasn't breastfeeding anymore, and then he was able to eat on his own. And the second is a maturity thing. He grew up. There are people who are maybe have advanced years on the passport, but they're still babies. And there could be very small children that are wise beyond their years. And the point is that Moshe became wise, or perhaps wise beyond his years. He became very mature, very smart. Do we know how old Moshe Rabbeinu is now? He's a boy. He's a boy. So the question then becomes, if Vayigdal, one is talking about his physical condition, his biological reality, and the other is talking about his psyche, right? It's a psychoschematic statement. It's talking about his maturity, it's talking about his emotions, it's talking about his intelligence. So then the two Vayigdals, they're not on the same page. They're not talking about the same thing. And from Rashi's perspective, somehow they're both talking about stature. They're both talking about stature. Only one is not talking about meal times. According to Ramban, one is meal times, and the other is maturity. According to Rashi, the word Vayigdal comes from the word Gadol. Gadol means stature. And stature can mean one of two things. Stature could mean physical stature. Stature could mean proverbial stature. Person has stature. Because that's the word, a Gadol. What is a Gadol? A Gadol be Yisrael, a great person of Israel. It's a person who has stature. So either they have physical stature, they're striking because they're 6'3", or because they have stature. They could be a very short person physically, but that person has stature. And here, from Rashi's perspective, both descriptions, albeit very different and taking place at different times in Moshe Rabbeinu's life, both are addressing his stature. One addresses his physical stature, one addresses his proverbial stature. So I think maybe this is the reason that Rashi says that, and you'll see later, when we'll delve more deeply into this, how actually it refers to two levels of Moshe's stature in a very profound way. We'll see that soon. So why did Moshe Rabbeinu go out to see the situation with his brothers? So Ramban says because he was told that he was a Hebrew. And when he discovered he's a Hebrew, he wanted to find out what was going on with his own family. So the first thing that touched Moshe was the familial connection. He was a family person, cared about family. And that's why it says Echav, his brothers. The Emek Davar says something very interesting. He says Moshe Rabbeinu looked into their burden. What does it mean, looked into their burden? How deeply do you have to look into the burden? They had an enormous amount of bricks they had to produce on a daily basis. They had to build these houses. It doesn't require any deep intuition to understand that this is hard labor. So he says something very interesting. He says Moshe Rabbeinu understood that the work was not really for the ultimate purpose of the building. That the work was there to be debilitating. Pharaoh didn't need the buildings. He didn't care about the buildings. And incidentally, this is the worst kind of torture. Because when a person is doing something, but they feel that they're actually accomplishing something, so the accomplishment gives them a sense of self-value, a sense of worth. When you feel you're working hard and accomplishing absolutely nothing, it's totally discombobulating. It tears a person apart. And the Medrash tells us that these storehouses were built in swamp areas. So that people would put enormous amounts of labor, thousands and thousands of hours of work, and then they would watch the building crumble and collapse within a few years. So all the work was worthless. And they knew that they were building buildings that would collapse. And they had a sense they weren't even making a contribution. The communists, Yimach Shemam, one of the things they used to do to torture the prisoners, they would yoke them to a mill that usually is yoked by an animal. And they would make them walk around and around, dragging the heavy millstone, but there was no wheat inside. Because, you ask the question, if they're using the labor, the slave labor, at least produce flour for the nation. But the communists didn't care about their own nation. All they want to do is break these people. So to work in a back-breaking way, and to know you're accomplishing absolutely nothing. This, as the Emek Davar, is the meaning of Vayar. That's the looking into it. Moshe Rabbeinu realized that it's all a facade, that all of this labor, that all of this work, that all of this supposed national concern and national interest, none of it's true. And he realized that the Jewish people realized this. They knew that they were being exploited. They knew that they were being broken. So this is very, very painful for him when he understood all this. And that required intuition. You had to understand what you were seeing, and Moshe did. And what was the next thing he saw? The verse continues now. Vayar, he saw Ish Mitzri. He saw there was an Egyptian man. And he was Make Ish Ivri. He was beating a Hebrew man. Me'echa, from amongst his brothers. So Rashi says, it doesn't even tell you that Vayar means he looked into it. It's self-understood. And so he gives you the background. The truth is that beatings were commonplace. Many Egyptians beat Hebrews. Hebrews were available for beatings. Why not? It was not different than in Lithuania. Even before the Nazis came in, after the Soviets were routed for 3 days in between, guess what the Lithuanians did? They killed Jews. Thousands of Jews. Before the first Nazi marched in. Today they rewrite history. They say, no, it wasn't us. It's the Nazis. They made us do it. It's not true. It's not. Thousands of Jews were killed in Lithuania. The country with the highest mortality rate of any country in Europe was Lithuania. Not because of the Nazis. The same Nazis were everywhere. Because of the locals. The neighbors. I was reading the gruesome, horrific things they did. They sawed off the head of a rabbi and put it on top of a Torah to torment the people. Horrible things. So the beatings were common. And the Jew had no protection. And the Jew had no recourse. But why was this Jew being beaten? And why was this Mitzri beaten? So Rashi tells us there's a background here. And the background here is Ish Mitzri, that this Egyptian man was not just a fellow who said, hey, here's a Jew. That's target practice. No. Negeshoya. This was somebody who was part of the work detail. He was an actual commandant who oversaw the slave labor. Memuna al Sheiter Yisrael. He was the one responsible for the Jewish, so to speak, capo leadership. Now, I use the word kapo very carefully because here, the Jews who were conscripted into being the leadership of the slave detail, they were not cruel to the people. On the contrary, they were beaten on behalf of the people. So they didn't want to get their hands dirty, these monsters. So they got the Jews to beat their fellow Jews, or to organize their fellow Jews, and they would just beat the leadership. So this is an Egyptian who really should not have had to do with Ish Mitzri, because he would have been beating the leadership to cow the Jew into submission. But this fellow, he was a noiges who was memuna al shaita yisrael. V'hoya ma'amidam, he was the one oftentimes who would wake them mikrois hagever, from the crawl of the rooster. Now, anybody who's ever slept on a farm knows that the rooster starts calling. It's not exactly light outside, right? You have to be a rooster to know that the day's about to break, because there's no other evidence for it. That's why we say hanoisen lechsech v'bina, right? So they had these roosters, and the roosters were crowing, and he would go in and he would wake up the Jews. And what did he do? So he was maki ish mitzri. It was not just a beating. Rashi says malkehu. He would beat him physically, but reidehu, he would demean him. He would abuse him. So he was beating and abusing him. He was degrading him and attacking him, tormenting him, abusing him emotionally and mentally, besides physically. So what's the story? Like, why did he decide to pick on a certain Jew and, get into his kishkas and abuse him mentally and emotionally? Like, whatever, they beat all Jews. Why this Jew is malkei over there? What was up with this? So Rashi tells us now the rest of the story, which is brought down in the Medrash, and Rashi talks about this actually later on, alludes to this later on in the Torah when we get to the middle of the book of Leviticus. Baila shel Shlomis bas Divri Haya. This was the husband of a woman whose name was Shlomit. And this Shlomit, unfortunately, was not one of our heroes. She was like a licentious kind of person, and she liked male attention a little too much. And she made herself very visible. V'nasan einav ba. And this Egyptian, she caught his eye, and he kind of became infatuated with her. And therefore, Balayla, when he came in the middle of the night to the house, he woke up the husband. He forced him out of his house. And then the Egyptian, he went back into the house and he got into his bed. And he raped her, but she didn't know the difference. And kisvura shehi baila, she thought it was her husband that had come back. And he went back to bed afterwards. He understood what had happened. He figured it out. When this Egyptian saw that the Jew had his number, so he felt ashamed and embarrassed. Then he would torment him and he would beat him and abuse him all day long, because I got your number. I know what you did to me. The Jew had no recourse, but he figured it out, and the Egyptian couldn't stand it. So Ibn Ezra says something interesting. Why does it say that he saw a ish ivri me'echav? It's really redundant. He saw a Hebrew from his brothers. It's redundant for two reasons. First of all, the beginning of the verse says Vayetze el echav. Moshe went out to his brothers. So we know this is all about the brothers. No, he considers Hebrews his brothers. Number two, it says ish ivri. So it's an ish ivri. We know Moshe is an ivri. So if it's an ish ivri, obviously it's me'echav. So the Ibn Ezra says, furthermore, you should know that this actually was a Levite, or he was from the family of Moshe. So I'm not sure how that would work out, because the Levites weren't slaves, and here this was a family of Moshe, but apparently it was the family of Moshe. Maybe she was a Levite and he had married. I don't know. It was the family of Moshe. It was Mim Mishpachte, the Ibn Ezra says. So we see Moshe Rabbeinu once again is a person with a sense of family values. First thing about leadership: many leaders do not care about their own family. They're bigger than family. They take care of a nation. And the first thing we learn about Moshe Rabbeinu is that he had a soft spot, even from his earliest youth, for family. Even though he was appointed by the Pharaoh to a big position, when he found that this was family, he felt a connection. As the Seforno says, it was mitzad ha'achva, it was out of the brotherhood, out of the familial connection. This is why Moshe Rabbeinu's heart raged. This is why he wanted to exact vengeance, because he felt his family was being abused. Now, the Eir HaChaim says that we know there was two kinds of Jews. There were the Jews who left Egypt and the Jews who didn't leave Egypt. Incidentally, the Jews who left Egypt were in a much smaller percentage. Only 20% of Jews actually left Egypt. 80% stayed behind. So the Chaim suggests that Moshe Rabbeinu saw that this was one of the, intuitively he knew that he would someday leave Egypt. He was a good guy. He was Me'echov. And so he felt a deeper sense of kinship. He said, this is not just a Hebrew, not just my brethren, but it's Me'echov. It's one of my kindred souls, and he felt this special connection. So what did Moshe do? The Torah says, in verse 12, Vayifen koi v'choi, Moshe Rabbeinu looks one to one side and the other side, Vayar ki einish, and he sees there's no man, Vayaches ha-mitzvah, he strikes the Egyptian, Vayitmeneu b'chayil, he hides the evidence in the sand. So the first thing we know of Moshe is that he pursued justice, and he was not afraid to take the most extreme measure when there was no choice. He killed the perpetrator. And then he hid the evidence. Rashi says, what is the meaning of Vayifin koi v'choi? He looked around. So Rashi says, once again, this is Moshe Rabbeinu's sleuthing abilities to figure out exactly what was going on very quickly. Ra ma'asaloi b'bayis, o ma'asaloi b'sada. He looked deeply into the situation. He understood that this was a situation that was untenable. He saw what this fellow had done in his house. He raped his wife. And he saw that afterwards, as soon as he knew about it, he began to torment him and come after him. And therefore, Moshe Rabbeinu saw both of these things, and he couldn't take it anymore. Rashi says, but if you want to read it straightforward, okay, so it is what it is. What happened? He looked around. He wanted to see, is anybody going to see me? That's what the Rabbi Mendel he explains it straight up. Moshe Rabbeinu wanted to make sure nobody was there to see him and report him. And of course, no Egyptian was there. But unfortunately for Moshe Rabbeinu, he found out that there were Jews who saw. And he found out that his own brethren, that he had risked his life for, would be ready to turn him in. This was for Moshe Rabbeinu a very, very sad moment, sad realization. But we'll get to that later. Now, the Ksava Kabbalah says, he looked around, not to see if he'd get caught. Moshe Rabbeinu wasn't even afraid of that. He was ready to defend himself. He wanted to see if somebody would come to his defense. He said, if I'll go after this guy, am I going to basically be inciting a hornet's nest? And then I'll have to deal with a whole bunch of soldiers, and then I won't be able to deal with this. So he looked to see if there's anybody armed, any other soldiers around. He said, I can do this myself, and that's when he decided to go for it. Now the Emek Dover, once again, says something very deep. He says, Vayifin kai v'chai, clearly we see from Rashi, is not just on a literal level, but it has to be deeper. And he follows the same approach as before. The Emek Dover earlier said that Moshe Rabbeinu looked into the work, and he understood that the work was designed to break the spirit of the Jewish people. It was crafted to be debilitating. The Pharaoh didn't need the buildings being built. They were going to collapse anyway. They were not going to last. So the Emek Dover says now further that he understood that there was no recourse. Had there been any legal recourse, Moshe Rabbeinu would have taken it. If there was any possibility of taking this guy to court and say, this is racism. He raped a woman, and now he's beating her husband, and the only reason is because he can get away with it. This is like unbelievable injustice. And Egypt was like a cultured country. Egypt was a country that had law and order. They comported themselves according to higher values. They had philosophy. This is one of the most developed countries in the world at the time. Maybe the Chinese rivaled them. Maybe. I don't know if they did. Ancient Egypt was an amazing society. But there was no recourse. Like Nazi Germany. Philosophers, law and order, in an active ASPCA that took care of dogs, but now no rights for Jews. No right for the Hebrew. And he saw that there was nothing else. Moshe Rabbeinu saw nothing could be done. When he saw there was nothing to be able to do, when there was nobody to lodge a complaint, and the Emek Vayar ki einish, he looked around. He said, there's nobody. Nobody will even take the complaint. Nobody will care. They'll say, oh, it's a Jew. Why did you say so? That's not a complaint. He has no rights. When Moshe Rabbeinu saw this, so that's when Moshe Rabbeinu acts very, very affirmatively, neutralizes the beast, and buries him. So now let's take a look in the Rebbe's Biur. We're going to have two very, very interesting perspectives here that the Rebbe adds. So first, let's talk about the Vayigdal business, the Moshe Rabbeinu growing up. We talked about Rashi, and we talked about Ramban, different levels of Vayigdal. And the Rebbe now is going to identify the notion of stature on a deeper level. So Rashi said it's all stature related. The Rebbe follows that approach of stature. And on page Ayin Beis, Siman Chaf of the Birei Chumash. The Rebbe says, Yesh lefarashes mashma'usan shel shtei gedulos elu beberuchnius. Both of these stature elements, these stature dimensions, can be explained entirely in spiritual terms. In Rashi, they're explained in literal terms. That stature is physical stature, and stature is a position of prominence or importance. But the Rebbe says the truth is that both of those can also allude to a deeper truth. Harishon l'koima. The first is for physical, for stature, for gestalt. Tall fellow. Shleimus ha'atzmis o Moshe Rabbeinu. This represents Moshe Rabbeinu's personal spiritual development. Sheshir koimase haruchnius, that his spiritual gestalt was developed, and it was tall. In fact, it was towering. It was gevaya mikol min ha'anushi. It towered above all other human beings. Kedivrei Chazal, like the words of our sages, and this is found in the Gemara and Maseches Shabbos on page 92, that it says that Moshe Rabbeinu, from him we learn that that the Shechina, the divine presence, cannot reside ela al chacham. Person has to be wise. Person has to be giber. Person has to have inner strength. Person has to be usher. Person has to be wealthy or affluent, not needing other people's money and not always running after profit. And finally, bal koima, a person of gestalt. And there's a question: what does this mean? A person has to be physically tall. Why is he physically tall to be a prophet? What happens if he's physically short? And the deeper explanation is it's not talking about physical height, because the extra inches of bone and plasma or sinew are irrelevant. Body size is not what this is about, but it's about bal koima. It's about having stature. It's about being a person who has developed his spiritual stature. V'hasheni l'gdula. The second is for greatness. How did Rashi explain it? That he was given a job. So the Rebbe says this now speaks to Moshe Rabbeinu, not insofar as his own personal spiritual stature is concerned, but rather Moshe Rabbeinu kemanhig, Moshe Rabbeinu as a leader, Moshe Rabbeinu as a Raya Yisrael, as a shepherd in Israel. In other words, Moshe Rabbeinu not as he self-developed, but Moshe Rabbeinu as he developed insofar as others were concerned. You could have a person who's an extraordinary person themselves, but doesn't care about others. Moshe Rabbeinu was an extraordinary person. He was wise and intuitive and talented and creative. Moshe Rabbeinu was empathetic. Moshe Rabbeinu was responsible, and he was ready to do for others. And there you have these two ideas. And the Rebbe says that if you think about it, these two qualities of Moshe are actually alluded to already in yesterday's reading where we read of Moshe Rabbeinu's birth. There's a machlokes amongst our sages about the meaning of the word Vatera Eisei Ki Toivu. Moshe was born and they saw he was good. So there's two opinions. One opinion is Shenolad Mohol, that he was born already circumcised, he didn't need a bris milah. Or Shenismale Habayas Kuli Oida, that the house was filled with light, and of course other faith systems adopted this idea, they love it, and they made a whole thing out of it. But this is, yes, this description of Moshe's birth, 3,400 plus years ago. So, no, it is not something that was created 2,000 years ago or 1,500 years ago. This is an idea that is as old as the Jewish people themselves. Now, what's the difference between Moshe Rabbeinu being born circumcised, having a bris milah, or Moshe Rabbeinu being born and engendering light just by his birth? So the Rebbe says, the first opinion emphasizes Moshe Rabbeinu's own perfection. He didn't need engineering. He was born perfect, the way a Jew is supposed to be. He was born already without the Arla, which this represents the idea of Noilad Mahol. The second opinion speaks about Moshe Rabbeinu as he could do for others. Nismale Habayis Kuli Erda. The house was filled with light. Moshe was a baby. The light didn't do anything for him, but the light was helpful for others. And when they saw he was good, meaning he shed light for others, they said, his name is Tuvia, or Yedidya, or El Yakum, or various other names that were given to him. So this is the way we see that the Moshe Rabbeinu's greatness, the stature of Moshe, the development of Moshe as a leader takes place both on a personal level. He is a great person, but his greatness is emphasized in the idea that he's willing and ready to do for others, to become responsible for a nation. Now, the Rebbe says there's an extraordinary lesson that we can and must learn from the story of Moshe Rabbeinu smiting the Egyptian and getting rid of the evidence. And the lesson is not that we should go around killing people or hiding their bodies, chas v'shalom. Page Ayin Gimel, on to the next simon. Mimaisa zeh shel Moshe Rabbeinu. From this story, this narrative of Moshe Rabbeinu. Hamaisa harishen miteich pe'uleisav shel Moshe. It is the very first narrative of Moshe Rabbeinu's lifetime. The rest of this book will follow the narrative of Moshe Rabbeinu's lifetime. It will end on the last day of his life. But from the third reading of Parsha Shemos, we begin to hear about narratives of Moshe. In Parshas, in the second reading, we hear about the narratives of Moshe too, the narratives of Moshe's birth and Moshe's childhood. From the third reading and onward, we read about the narratives in which Moshe was not a passive observer, but Moshe was an active participant. He makes choices. He does things. So this is the first story in which Moshe Rabbeinu is not a passive participant, meaning he gets born, and the Torah is narrating, here's what happened to the baby, or the baby was placed in the rushes by his sister, and she found by a princess, and then sent home for feeding. No. Here Moshe Rabbeinu is now in charge of his narrative. Here's the narrative of what Moshe Rabbeinu did. And so it will be now, going forward. So this is the first time Moshe Rabbeinu does something. What does he do? Well, the Rebbe says there's we can learn a limud, a wonderful hira nifla, a wondrous lesson in Avodas Hashem. And it goes like this. Moshe gadol bebeis hamelech. Moshe Rabbeinu was raised in the royal palace, the king's house. Bitay shel hamelech, the daughter of the king, da'aga l'chol tzrachav. She doted on Moshe. She provided him with everything and anything he could possibly want. V'lo chaser ledavar. Moshe Rabbeinu was missing nothing. Missing nothing. He had everything he could possibly want, Moshe Rabbeinu had. Now, Lamrois kol zois, despite the fact that Moshe Rabbeinu had the most privileged life, he grew up literally with a silver spoon in his mouth, cushioned from any kind of pain or difficulty, from any kind of sorrow, anguish, totally protected. But Moshe doesn't stay there. He doesn't stay in his privileged place. Lo nishar Moshe bebeis hamelech. What does he do? Yotza. He went out. And why did he go out? Because he was curious? Because he was adventurous? Because he wanted fun? Why did he go out of his place of safety, his place of security and comfort? He wanted to see how do his brothers fare. In other words, he was motivated not by adventure or curiosity. He was motivated by concern and empathy. So he goes out of his place of comfort, to see what? He's on one of these fact-finding missions that does nothing. And people used to go on fact-finding missions to Eastern Europe. What did they do? Well, we found facts. What did you do with the facts? We filed a report. And then we had a committee meeting. And then we had another committee meeting. And then we made a report. What was the point of gathering information? What did Moshe go out for? The answer was, this was not about fact-finding. This was not about writing a book on anthropology or documenting history. This was about seeing what he could do. He went out of his comfort zone. He left his own safety and security. He went into a place that was profoundly uncomfortable because he was motivated by concern for another and because he wanted to see what he might possibly be able to do. And what happened? When he now became aware that there was an Ish Mitzri, and that this Ish Mitzri was Makeh Ish Ivri, that there was this Egyptian man who was beating, tormenting, and abusing the Hebrew man. He didn't think for a moment. He didn't blink. He placed his own life in danger. Just to be able to save somebody else, to save his brother. And the Rebbe says, which brother are we talking about? This is not some kind of lofty, important, and powerful Jew. This was Bailas Shlemis Bas Divri. This was the husband of Shlemis Bas Divri, who was a Jewish woman who had sunk into the lowest levels of moral deprivation. In fact, she was the only one. From all the Jewish girls, there was not a single licentious Jewish woman who was seeking male attention, who behaved in a way that was immodest. Not a single one. This is the only incident of rape in the entire history of Hebrew slavery. The only incident of rape. The only incident. That tells you something about the Jewish people, and that's what the Torah uses her name to. The one virtue that she has is that she shows us how chaste everybody else was, how modest everybody else was. Hayechida mikol b'nai Yisrael, the only one. Pirsum ha'akosov. The Torah tells you about it. Why would the Torah tell us about that? It's terrible. Here we are now, 3,400 years later, we're still talking about this poor woman, and we know that she was immodest, licentious. Like, why was it? And we know her name? That's so embarrassing. Well, the answer is because through her we know that everybody else was good. So she backhandedly makes a big contribution. And the hira, the lesson for us, even when a Yid finds himself in the king's palace. We are not speaking here about a physical palace. None of us yearn to grow up in the palace of a pharaoh. We speak here about a much greater king than a pharaoh could ever imagine to be, the king of all kings. We're living in the king's palace. We're living in a place of Torah and Tefillah. The king's palace does not have gold and silver, but it has prayers and it has Torah study. That's the king's palace. This is the king's palace. And we're sitting here sheltered in an environment of Torah, an environment of vibrant Yiddishkeit. Nothing is missing. The lights are on, Baruch Hashem. The heat is on. There's fresh coffee just a few steps away. Everything is here. You don't need anything. And the Yid could say, you know what? It's a day off. I'm going to spend my time here. There's so many books to read. There's coffee. I can bring myself a little lunch. I'll immerse myself in holiness all day. So the Torah comes along and says, maybe you should go out of your place. Maybe you should transcend your comfort zone. Find if there's another Yid who's maybe missing something. Maybe somebody could use your help today. And then see if you could lisayel to help him. Now, who are we talking about? A fancy Jew, an important Jew, a Jew with a great lineage? No. It could be a Yehudi who's pachas shebchusim. He's the lowest of the low, maybe. He was mishpacha hayirudas b'Yisrael, maybe the lowest family amongst Israel. Find him, help him, that he should overcome his low situation. To save him, when his own Mitzrayim could be a proverbial thing. It's not a geographic thing. He has his own strictures, his own narrow straits, his own things which are squeezing and obstructing and obscuring his own neshama. And take that Yid and bring him, al derech hamelech, you bring him into the palace. You bring him into Yiddishkeit. I got a call from somebody recently, and he told me that I met a certain person, and he said he's a grandson of the Baal Shem Tov. He said, and he's so lost, I want you to please reach out to him. And I thought to myself, and if he was just a grandson of Avraham Avinu, that wouldn't be good enough. This person didn't understand what I was saying. Does it have to be? It's a real story. It's happened a few days ago. Does it have to be a grandson of the Baal Shem Tov? What difference does it make? Every Yid is beloved in Hashem's eyes. It matters not whether it's a fancy Jew, a Jew with fancy lineage, or not. It doesn't make a difference. Every Yid is beloved. Moshe Rabbeinu didn't run out of the palace for a grandson of the Baal Shem Tov. Moshe Rabbeinu ran out of the palace for the husband of Shlomis Bas Divri. Shlomis Bas Divri. It doesn't matter. And that, my dear friends, is what stature and leadership is really all about. And the Rebbe maintains that this is not just for leaders, but every Yid has to be ready to serve as a leader in this sense. And to take a leadership role as, don't just care about your own Yiddishkeit. You should care about your Yiddishkeit. Your davening is important. Your learning Torah is important. Your mitzvah performance is important. But don't leave it there. Then transcend your comfort zone, reach out, find another Yid, and in doing so, we learn to emulate the beautiful messages and lesson that Moshe Rabbeinu's life brings us. And that's all for today.